Number 1.
33-year-old Irasema Chavez was found brutally murdered inside her Arlington, Texas apartment on January 20, 2012. Irasema was fairly new to that area and to the United States in general. She had grown up in Mexico but had recently relocated to Texas after she was inspired to move by her sister and brother-in-law, who already lived there. According to Irasema's brother-in-law, Irasema had made a ton of new friends since she moved to the Arlington area, and she loved to go to dance clubs with them. Irasema had also recently come out to her family and friends as a lesbian shortly before her death. On the night of January 19, 2012, Irasema called her sister and asked her and her niece, who was visiting from Mexico, to come over. They declined, as Irasema's sister did not want to drive over to her apartment that late at night. However, Irasema's sister planned to drop her niece off at Irasema's apartment the following day so the two could spend the day together. When that time came the next morning, Irasema's sister dropped her niece off at Irasema's apartment complex and waited until she got inside safely before she left. However, just a minute after Irasema's niece entered her apartment, she came running back out, screaming for somebody to call the police. According to her, Irasema was dead. She had been murdered, stabbed over 100 times. Surveillance footage from the previous night shows an unidentified person wearing a hood approaching Irasema's door and knocking. The person is seen standing there for about a minute before the door opens, and he is let in. Investigators consider this person to be a suspect and are hoping to identify him. None of Irasema's friends or family members recognize the suspect, however they believe that he was known to Irasema since she let him into her apartment. A clip of the surveillance footage can be viewed here. Any person with information on the identity of Irasema's killer may be eligible for a reward up to $1,000. If you have any information that may help, please contact Arlington Crime Stoppers at 817-469-TIPS, 8477.
Number 2.
Saturday, October 12, 1974. The season has begun to change to fall, but the weather outside is still rather pleasant, at least here in Palo Alto, California. The previous night, a Saturday, had been a bit brisk, but was still rather nice. It was the perfect kind of evening to go on a late-night stroll throughout town, perhaps with a loved one. Imagine that you're a security guard working on one of these nights. It's a Saturday, and most of the people you know are enjoying themselves in some small way. Maybe they're out and about, enjoying the college lifestyle of the Stanford University you work at, or perhaps enjoying a quiet night in. Maybe they're finding a way to celebrate the 13-13 tie football game, the second tie in a rather disappointing season for the university's Cardinals thus far. Either way, it's a Saturday night, and you're left to work the overnight shift. You're probably not going to give the job your all, are you? You might not slack, so to speak, but you're definitely not going to give it 100%. It's a Saturday night, and no matter how much you enjoy your job, you're going to wish you were somewhere else. So as you go around the Stanford University campus, making the rounds of your detail, you might rush through certain parts of the job. Or, at least, not give certain things your full attention. If you're a less than dedicated security guard, you might even just choose not to perform certain duties. I mean, what's the harm? It's not like anything is going to happen tonight, anyways. If you're security guard Stephen Crawford, this might have been your night. You might have been tired, lethargic, pissed off at the world for having to work on the weekend, or any such series of emotions, but you might have just skipped parts of your job. Not out of any nefarious nature, but simple because you've been working this job for months, or even years now, and you're used to skipping corners whenever you can. You know that bad things don't happen here, so this is just another night, devoid of any excitement or seriousness. But then, making the rounds again before the end of your shift, hours later, you make a discovery that will shake the foundation of your life forever. Bruce Perry and Arlis Perry were both natives of Bismarck, North Dakota. They were born and raised in the quiet, sleepy town in the American Midwest and attended Bismarck High School, where the two met. By all accounts, they were an all-American type of couple. Bruce was every bit of the bookworm as he was an athlete, setting many local records for his track and field exploits, while also succeeding as a scholar, and Arlis was the conservative, religious-minded cheerleader who was also very bright and kind. The two met during their time at Bismarck High School, where they soon became smitten with one another. They began to court each other and date, even though, by now, Bruce was committed to attending Stanford University, which was over 1,500 miles away. The two decided to continue seeing each other, even though the distance would keep them apart for at least a year. As someone who's done the long-distance thing before, I can understand their trepidation at doing so, but at least I was comforted with the existence of cell phones, Skype, and modern technology. Back in 1974, you had to endure a long-distance relationship through a landline or writing letters, which is not a process I would envy of those that lived through this period of time. Bruce, now attending Stanford as a pre-med student, had his work cut out for him. This is no easy feat on its own, but trying to balance a long-distance relationship while also being in a foreign environment so far removed from anything you've ever known. It sounds downright impossible. And it's true. Stanford University, located in Palo Alto, California, was very different from anything Bruce had ever known in North Dakota. This was in 1974, just after the Flower Power era had taken over California, and Bruce had gone from conservative-minded North Dakota to tech-savvy, liberal California in an instant. Life was different here, but Bruce hardly noticed it from behind his medical textbooks. In their long-distance relationship, Arlis began to focus herself on work and her church. In the year after graduating high school alongside Bruce, she attended Bismarck Junior College. She also worked for the Duncan Perry dental office, saving up money for a major life-changing decision. Notably, Arlis was also an ardent Christian, and she worked with many organizations for the church, including Young Life and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in Bismarck. In fact, when she wasn't studying for his community college classes or working, she was most likely spreading the word of her church as a missionary or participating in other church events. Bruce's first year at Stanford was taxing on both of them. Each regretted not being able to spend time with one another, so throughout that year the two of them reached an agreement of sorts. They would get married, and then they wouldn't have to spend time apart from one another. In the summer of 1974, the young couple married in their hometown, at the Bismarck Reformed Church. It was a beautiful, picture-worthy affair, celebrated on August 17. For the next week or so, the young couple took a small honeymoon to a cabin owned by Arlis's parents, but then began their trek out to California, where their new life would begin together. Now Bruce and Arlis Perry, the couple moved into an apartment in Quillen Hall, a residence reserved for married couples. It wasn't anything special, but the couple began to make it into a small home for themselves. Just weeks after their wedding, Bruce was back at his pre-med workload, spending most of his waking hours in class, studying, or preparing for some upcoming test. Arlis tried to busy herself with becoming a homemaker, but soon landed a job as a receptionist for a nearby Palo Alto law firm. Throughout much of her spare time, Arlis would go for walks or jogs around the Stanford campus. She eventually found the Stanford Memorial Church, which was huge and as grand as anything she had ever seen. She became a frequent visitor to this church, which is very understandable. If you look up images of this church online, you might be in awe. It's beautiful. One of the only drawbacks to the recent move was Arlis Perry's supposed loneliness. She recounted, in letters and phone calls to family and friends back in Bismarck, that she felt incredibly lonely. "Friends are hard to find here," she wrote to a friend in North Dakota. "Many times I've been tempted to go knock on doors asking if anybody needs a friend. But I guess we just have to appreciate each other and trust the Lord for new friends too." Arlis would also write to her friends how excited she was to enjoy the California weather and how life was beginning to fall into place when she got the job at the law firm. Things were starting to look up for this young couple, but fate, as always, works in mysterious ways. Something was afoot and would eventually unfold just weeks after their wedding. On the night of October 12th, things were relatively normal on the Stanford campus. The football team, which had enjoyed a huge upswing in popularity over the past few seasons, had been having a less than stellar season and just tied its second game in the season against rivals UCLA, en route to an 0-3-2 record. Many students were out and about, some of them partying, as college students are wont to do, but things were relatively quiet. It was a soothing night, as summer made way for fall, so it wasn't unusual that Arlis decided to go for a walk. According to Bruce, this wasn't an unusual activity for her, and on this night, Bruce decided to join her. He set down his medical textbooks for a short while and accompanied her out into the night air. The two walked for a short while, aiming for a mailbox in the distance. Arlis had a bundle of letters to deliver to her friends and family in North Dakota, even though the post wouldn't be picking them up until Monday morning. But Bruce figured that this would be a good jaunt for the two to spend time on, and things were going fine for a while. Eventually, a fork in the couple's conversation led to a small bickering match. It's hard to know how this came to light, but the couple began to argue about which one of the two was responsible for putting air into the couple's vehicle. A silly argument, but I'm sure that each of us can empathize. I remember some ridiculous argument with my own wife that started with the subject of whose shampoo was being used, so I get it. But at the tail end of this small argument, taking place on the Stanford campus just before midnight, Arlis requested for her husband to give her some alone time. They were nearby the Stanford Memorial Church, a place she frequented on her own and with Bruce, and Bruce was more than willing to let the two find cooler heads on their own. He headed back to the couple's apartment at Quillen Hall, roughly half a mile away, while Arlis went inside the church to pray. When Arlis went into the church, there were two people inside that noticed her entrance. She sat up at the front of the church, on the left-hand side, and knelt down to pray. The two silent worshippers, sitting in the back of the church, took note of her presence before they themselves left, just moments later. As the two young worshippers were leaving, they noticed a young man entering the church. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old, with parted sandy blonde hair and a medium build. The witnesses only remember him as looking youthful and wearing a short-sleeved, blue shirt. While Bruce returned home and began mentally preparing for his argument with Arlis to continue in a short while, something else was unfolding. Something dark and terrifying. At the beginning of the podcast, I had you, the listener, imagine yourself as an overnight security guard that worked on the weekends. That was the job description of Stephen Crawford, who worked on the Stanford campus in the 1970s. Stephen was working on the night in question, October 12, 1974. He was responsible for going around and ensuring the buildings were all closed and locked up at the proper times, and he was responsible for closing up the Stanford Memorial Church on the night Arlis Perry stopped by. The church closed at midnight, which is just minutes after Arlis was last seen by the two eyewitnesses. According to his testimony, Stephen briefly entered the church and gave the following message, which echoed off of the church's reverent walls: "We're closing for the night. The church is being locked for the night now. If anyone is here, you'll have to leave." This was shortly after midnight, as Stephen was running just a few minutes behind on his shift. By his account, it was roughly 12:10 a.m. when he locked up the church with that message, seeing nobody in the church. Not Arlis, not the later eyewitnesses, nor the sandy-haired gentleman seen entering the church just minutes earlier. According to Stephen, he then locked up the church, leaving whatever secrets were unfolding to themselves. Bruce Perry was waiting alone at their apartment for a short while, waiting for his young, petite wife to return home after a few minutes alone at the church. They only lived half a mile away, which isn't too far, and by 12:15, fear began to linger at the back of Bruce's mind. According to him, he left the apartment and began to head up to the church. Hoping to at least encounter Arlis along the way, Bruce was surprised to make it all the way up to the Memorial Church and find the doors closed, locked, and the lights turned off. He traveled to a side door and even to the back of the church, finding nothing of note and no doors opened. Bruce then began to comb the campus, looking for any sign of Arlis. It wasn't like she had any friends or family to call or visit, since she had only been in California for a matter of weeks and constantly reminded Bruce that she knew no one in the area. Also, with her rather conservative nature, the odds of her stumbling upon a party were slim to none, so he decided to look around, double-checking their route home and hoping to run into her on the way there. Or, God willing, find her already back at their cozy apartment. There was at least one witness, walking by the Stanford Memorial Church, that reported hearing an obscure sound, but that wouldn't be reported until later. On this night, it could have been anything, but no one would assume that it would be hostile or scary in nature. Bruce Perry returned to the couple's apartment and found himself facing an empty home. He began to resign himself to the hopes that Arlis was just upset and decided to go on an extended walk, or somehow fell asleep inside of the church and would be returning home any minute now. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, security guard Stephen Crawford was making another round around the Stanford campus. His job required him to make a visit through the church and make sure that there were no intruders or stragglers, and he supposedly did just that. The doors were closed and locked, and he reported that he saw and heard nothing while doing this. It wasn't until 3 in the morning, over 3 hours since she had last been seen, that Bruce Perry decided to phone the police and report his wife as missing. Nothing would keep her away for this long duration of time, no matter how serious their argument about tire pressure had gotten. Bruce told the dispatcher that he was worried she might have fallen asleep inside of the church and been locked inside as a result. Stanford security officers responded to the call, heading to the Memorial Church. It seems that these security officers didn't do much digging, as they found the church doors locked and reported that it was unlikely for there to be anyone inside. Despite the large nature of the church itself, there was no way for them to see inside, and they reportedly decided not to follow up on this lead. The truth about Arlis Perry wouldn't be discovered until hours later by the same security guard that had locked up the Stanford Memorial Church the night before. And, unfortunately, what he found was the stuff of nightmares. It was a short while after 5:30 in the morning, and Stephen Crawford was making another sweep of the campus. He was walking by the Memorial Church, checking to make sure that the doors were locked and secure, when he noticed that a side door had been opened. Police would later find that it had been forced open from the inside, leading to many theories about what had happened on that fateful night. Investigating the open door on the side of the church, Crawford proceeded in with trepidation. He looked into the church and found the altar to be untouched. Nothing of value had been stolen from it or the area, so it must have crossed Crawford's mind that it was nothing serious, petty kids looking for a place to be alone, or something similar. I'm not sure how Crawford's mind was working on this night, but he continued into the church, investigating the source of the open door. On the left-hand side of the church, among the front row of the pews, where she had last been seen alive by the 2 eyewitnesses hours earlier, Crawford would find Arlis Perry's body. She was naked from the waist down, with her pants draped across her lower half, almost in a ritualistic fashion. Sadly, Arlis Perry's last moments had been brutal and terrifying. She had been beaten and choked, to a serious degree, but that wasn't what had killed her. Whoever her killer was had come prepared and brought with them an ice pick, which was then lodged into her skull from behind her left ear. However, that wasn't the end of it. Either before she had been killed, or even after her brutal death, her body had been arranged and abused in a sadistic manner. Her blouse was ripped open, and her cold arms were held across her chest, holding close an altar candle placed between her breasts. Worst of all, and a warning to all of you, this is terrible, a large, 30-inch candle had been forced into her vagina as a final gory desecration of her body. Obviously, Crawford had to struggle with that mental image for the rest of his life. He immediately called his superiors, who got in touch with the Santa Clara Sheriff's Department, who held criminal jurisdiction over Stanford University. Before long, police officers and detectives were on the scene, and the planned Sunday Mass was moved to the back area of the church, where Reverend Robert Hamerton Kelly's service took on a much darker tone. Reverend Hamerton Kelly was a witness to the crime scene, which he personally described as ritualistic and satanic. He wanted to continue with the Sunday Mass because, in his words, he wasn't going to let evil triumph. Now that the fate of Arlis Perry was known, it was time to find her killer, or killers. And that began by delivering the horrifying news to her now suspicious husband, Bruce. As far as investigations go, they generally start from the inside out. You investigate the suspect's spouse and immediate family, then follow it up by secondary family members and close friends, then coworkers, etc. etc. I'm sure by now you all know the drill. Almost immediately, the police headed to the Perry couple's apartment at Quillen Hall. There, they were surprised to find Bruce Perry answering the door, covered in blood. According to Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, the detectives that made this house call wanted to arrest Perry on the spot. Here he was, covered in blood, and his young, pretty wife had just been brutally murdered hours beforehand. However, the blood that Perry was covered in was his own. He claims that he gets chronic nosebleeds when he is stressed out, a thing that I am very familiar with. I'm the same way, and my nose gets very sensitive around the change of the seasons. This happening in mid-October, as summer gives way for fall, is pretty explainable for me. So, as suspicious as he originally was to investigators, based on the rather newfound nature of their relationship and his suspicious appearance to early investigators, police weren't able to find much evidence linking Perry to the crime. The blood that he was covered in was tested and determined to be of the same type as his own, which I'm assuming was different than Arlis Perry's blood type, and he passed a polygraph test quite easily. Of course, polygraph tests are now known to be very fickle in nature and not at all a good measure of truth, but back in 1974, the tests were seen as gospel for criminal investigators. For them, this was enough to eliminate Bruce Perry as a suspect. From the get-go, detectives were focusing on finding a suspect that was a sexual deviant or a criminal that focused on sex-related crimes. It appeared that Arlis Perry hadn't been raped by her killer, but there was the matter of the candle found inside of her, and there was a church pillow found nearby the body, which had semen on it. Speaking of the candle found in Arlis's vagina, the police were able to lift a palm print from the surface of the candle, a palm print that didn't match either Bruce Perry or the security guard who discovered the body, Stephen Crawford. They focused on finding a match for the print, but didn't have any luck in the 100+ suspects they took a peek at. The investigation had a rough go of it early on, but it wouldn't get any easier. Police began to determine that Arlis had been murdered at roughly midnight, meaning that Stephen Crawford, the Stanford security guard, had likely not swept through the Memorial Church after 2 a.m. like he said he had. If he had indeed done a search of the church at this time, then it implied that Arlis was still alive and being kept hidden by her attacker, at least in some way. This would bring about a darker theory. Indeed, it's possible that whoever had murdered Arlis Perry had done so deliberately and slowly. She might have heard Stephen Crawford's pacing of the church, his rushed checking of the outer doors, and she might have even heard her own husband's pleas for his wife to come out shortly after midnight. Police would determine that the side door, which Stephen Crawford found ajar, had been forced open from the inside. This would imply that, if the police and Stephen Crawford had checked this door on separate occasions before 3 o'clock in the morning, then whomever had been inside had been in there for hours, alone with Arlis. It's very likely that this killer remained inside of the church until the Stanford security officers arrived after Bruce Perry's panicked 3 a.m. 911 call, and then decided to get out while they still could. Either way, it's likely that Arlis Perry's death was not only brutal, but she had to endure much before she met her eventual fate. Seeing as Arlis didn't know anyone in the surrounding area other than her husband, the question began to be asked, who would do such a horrendous, violent thing to a complete stranger inside of a church? The memorial service for Arlis Perry was held just a few days after her murder, on October 15. Morbidly, it took place at the Stanford Memorial Church, where she had been found just 2 days earlier. Bruce Perry was joined by his father and other family members at the front rows of the church, just feet away from where Arlis's body had been found. Sadly, there was nobody there that truly knew Arlis other than Bruce. She hadn't been in California long enough to make any friends, but they would hold a separate ceremony for her back in Bismarck. But before her funeral would take place in North Dakota, something interesting happened at her memorial service at the Stanford church. A coworker of hers that worked at the Palo Alto law firm was in attendance, and he was surprised to see Bruce Perry. Not because of Perry himself, but because he originally thought that Bruce Perry was another man entirely. According to this coworker, Arlis had started at the law firm just 2 weeks before her untimely murder. During this time period, she had not wanted Bruce to visit her at work just because she wanted to establish herself as a worker and a valuable employee before bringing in personal friends or family members. So Bruce never paid her a visit while she was working, but another man had, on the day before her murder. This man, the coworker told the sheriff's department later on, was whom he had imagined Bruce to be. He was in his early 20s, with regular length blonde hair, and he stood about 5'10". According to this coworker, this blonde-haired young man was a bit stocky on the athletic side of things, but looked relatively normal. Hence why the coworker mistook them for Bruce Perry, pre-med Stanford student. According to this coworker, this young man paid Arlis a visit on Friday, October 11th, which, as I stated, was just the day before her murder. Apparently, the conversation between this young man and Arlis had been rather serious in nature, lasting for close to 15 minutes, hence the coworker's reluctance to ask her about it. Surprisingly enough, the detectives investigating the crime at the time didn't do much digging into this potential suspect. Despite the fact that this general description matched up with the young man seen entering the church shortly before Arlis's murder, the investigators didn't do much following up with it. It's possible that looking for a well-groomed, sandy blonde-haired young man in 1970s Palo Alto was just too much of a stretch. And I can't really blame them, that must have described half of the Stanford populace back then, and maybe still does. But there is surprisingly little follow-up about it, which may perhaps be uncovered, because this still is, decades later, an open case. On Friday, October 18th, less than a week after her grisly murder, Arlis Perry was returned to her home of Bismarck, North Dakota. A funeral took place for her at the same place she had gotten married to Bruce Perry less than 2 months earlier, at the Bismarck Reformed Church. Her friends and family were outraged, and rightfully so. Their daughter, a young woman dedicated to her faith and to her family, had not even been gone for a quarter of the year and she had been horribly murdered by an unknown assailant. The horrid details of her murder weren't publicly released for some time. Thankfully, all that her family and friends knew of her murder, at the time, was that she had been murdered. They didn't know about the candle, they didn't know about the ice pick, they didn't know about the church pillow, they were saved those horrible details, at least for some time. Arlis Perry was buried in a local plot, in the North Dakota town, that she had loved to call home. She was finally home among her family and friends, but the circumstances were as dour and depressing as possible. Things could finally start to heal, for her friends, her family, and for her husband, now a widower. But while things could now begin to heal, so many questions were left unanswered. At around Halloween, less than 2 weeks after Arlis had been laid to rest, a temporary grave marker at her burial site was stolen. This was seen as cold and heartless by those close to her, but also very suspicious by those critical of the investigation. To these critics, this was a telltale clue that her killer, or killers, resided in Bismarck. None of the other grave markers at the cemetery were disturbed, just Arlis Perry's, which led many to believe that those responsible for the crime had claimed it as some kind of sick, morbid prize. This seemed to somewhat fit in with what the Santa Clara detectives had released, that there were at least 2 of Arlis's personal items stolen from the crime scene. Perhaps the killer had come back for another, a trophy of their dastardly sick act. But, of course, this theory leads to something rather far-fetched. If the killer was from Bismarck, would they really have stalked Arlis all the way to the California coast in an effort to get at her? Such a thing would not only be a surmountable task, but a costly and noticeable one. The detectives at the time of the murder have been criticized over the years and decades for not doing enough follow-up, especially in the Bismarck area. While unlikely, it is very possible that Arlis Perry's killer hailed from this North Dakota town and followed her all the way to Stanford in an effort to exact some sort of perceived revenge or to simply lash out at her. In Maury Terry's book, The Ultimate Evil, he alleges that a rumor started by Bruce Perry's parents involves Arlis trying to reach out to some satanic cultists in the Bismarck area in the year before she moved out to California. In this book, he theorizes that perhaps some of these cultists took the initiative to track her down, states away, and stage some kind of satanic ritual involving her inside of a church. I not only find this theory far-fetched, but also highly unlikely. In the same book, which I did get a lot of the details about the crime for this episode, Terry tries to make the assumption that this was just one of many murders perpetrated by a nationwide satanic cult, whose members include the son of Sam murderer David Berkowitz and even Charles Manson. This book came out in 1987, amid the United States satanic panic heyday, and grasps at a lot of straws to make the connection to this being a religious-fueled crime. While one finds it hard to ignore the religious imagery of the crime, especially when it comes to the location of the murder and the state of which Arlis Perry's body was found, it's hard to connect the dots to this being part of a nationwide conspiracy theory involving human sacrifice. David Berkowitz himself was the one who jump-started these rumors back in 1979 when he sent a book about witchcraft to North Dakota officials with a handwritten side note which read, "Arlis Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California, Stanford University." If you're not familiar with David Berkowitz or the son of Sam slayings, they were a rash of murders that took place in New York City in 1976 and 1977, ultimately killing 6 and wounding 7 others. I won't go into full detail on them, but David Berkowitz was eventually arrested and admitted to the crimes, claiming that he had been given orders from his neighbor's dog to commit the murders. He was found to be mentally competent enough to stand trial and was sentenced to serve 6 life sentences in prison for the crimes. During this time, he wrote many inflammatory letters to police and other authorities and seemed to enjoy the near-celebrity status he obtained by doing so. Eventually, there were laws passed that stopped criminals from profiting off of their crimes, known as the Son of Sam laws in his honor. He began to circulate the satanic cult rumors shortly after his arrest and after already admitting to the crimes. Most considered the rumors to be silly, perhaps just Berkowitz trying to keep his 15 minutes of undue fame lasting longer than possible, but there were others that were intrigued enough to dig into the rumors and some that bought into them, hook, line, and sinker. It's not my job to tell you what to think. I try and avoid that on this podcast. But I personally find it hard to believe that Berkowitz wasn't responsible for all of his own crimes, which he alleged in these initial rumors. He claims that the same nationwide satanic cult that killed Arlis Perry was responsible for other murders around the country and that he was a member of this cult. He tried to tie other notable serial killers into this cult, such as Charles Manson and Otis Toole, but years of digging by journalists and investigators have uncovered only soft pools of evidence, linking the crimes only through violent acts. There is little to no evidence suggesting a legitimate nationwide cult that practices inhuman sacrifice, which is why I find the theories so hard to swallow. It's also worth noting that many FBI investigators and profilers have gone on record calling Berkowitz's later claims bogus. Psychologists and forensic anthropologists have gone on record stating that these are most likely fantasies constructed by Berkowitz in his extended imprisonment, where he has been for now over 40 years.
Number 3.
January 20, 2012. A day that looked and felt just like any other day, according to Hilda Edgerton, about the day her husband was murdered 8 years ago today. There was nothing to make us be on guard at all, she added. That's why it slammed us so hard, emotionally, physically, and spiritually too. It did a lot to us. Every year around this time she allows herself to think back instead of forward. To survive her husband Stephon Edgerton's cold-blooded unsolved murder, she has had to let it go, let God handle it. The unsolved murder of popular Valdosta 96.7 radio DJ Juan Gotti remains one of Lowndes County's most jarring. The memory of the last time we talked was right directly after school, his widow told Valdosta Today, who had just left a Martin Luther King Jr. Day parade in Lake City with her new fiancé. He was getting ready to go into work at 6 p.m. He was reminding the children and me that he was going to get on the grill and cook for my grandmother's birthday the next day. He'd just introduced the boys to basketball and he was going to play with them. Just a father and his family, heading off to work. He'd just turned 40 in December. He threw up his peace signs, and the boys still do it to this day, and he said, "I love y'all, we'll see you tomorrow," Hilda said. And that was it. There would be no tomorrow. Her sons, Christian and Winston, were 7 and 6 respectively. Their daughter, Mia, was 13 at the time. They all loved their daddy. Hilda has a happy spirit, in spite of the pain the last 8 years have brought upon her and her family. Everybody else remembers him as Juan Gotti, she says with a laugh. But he was Stephon, daddy, son to us. He was such a clown. We were just about to hit our 14th wedding anniversary. The two met at Hope Missionary Baptist Church, which she says still hasn't fully recovered from his loss. He played piano there for 18 years and was beloved by the congregation. Originally from Waycross, he had moved here to attend what was VSC at the time. Hilda was a born and bred Valdosta girl. Another laugh. She has memories of Stephon good enough to outweigh the bad. There was so much bad that happened, you wonder how she endures. His shift was from 6 p.m. to midnight, Hilda told VT. He always did his last thing on the radio at 11:50, and he was always ready to walk out the door. And that's when he was approached. Hilda said he used to wear a headset up under his dreads. He had his mind in survival mode, she said. After he was shot he was able to call 911. Hilda said that, according to the news, he described the shooter as a white male, wearing either a cap or ski mask. Although she was never able to listen to the 911 recording, Rev. Floyd Rose did for her. One of the main things Rev. Rose said that struck him was that Stephon kept saying, "He ruined me. He destroyed me." This is the hard part for Hilda, the unbearable thought of listening to her husband's final words. He kept saying he didn't know who it was, trying to describe the suspect, Hilda recounted. While the 911 dispatcher attempted to keep him on the line and get more information, according to Hilda they had a hard time determining where he was, thinking he was at a popular nightclub on Highway 84 that has since burned down. He was shot once in the head, twice in the torso. That person intended to make sure he was dead, Hilda said. I thank God he didn't lie there and die like a dog, that God gave him that divine strength to lie there and make that call. He didn't code until they got him to the hospital. Investigated by the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, some people told her they felt like they weren't doing all they could to find the killer. I beg to differ, because Christy Griffin, the investigator, she really worked hard on the case, Hilda said. And it tore her up to see it affect us like it did, and I think she was doing all she could to find answers. Unfortunately, there were only had dummy security video cameras, Hilda said they found out later. Nobody knew that till after the fact, she added. The mystery consumed not only Hilda, but the community and those closest to her. Theories abounded. Some people said you're not pushing enough, and I said you don't know what it's like to keep this home and raise this family, she told Valdosta Today on Monday. They had me consumed the first 2 years. It was ridiculous. It was so overwhelming to heal. I almost had to tune people out and just say, God, when it's time for it to be revealed you will do it, when we can handle it. Does it hurt that we don't know? Yes, and we want to keep the story out so people don't forget. Lowndes County Sheriff Ashley Polk told Valdosta Today that though he wasn't sheriff at the time of the murder, he was of the opinion that the most likely suspect was killed in a shootout several years after Stephon was killed, but he did not give specifics of the investigation or the identity of the suspect. There's no way to know for sure if that was him, Sheriff Polk said. We are always open to hearing new information. If anyone has any, please come forward. Today, Hilda works in Quitman and Christian, now 16, plays football for the Brooks County High School Trojans, coached by Maurice Freeman, who goes to their church. Winston, now 15, goes to Valdosta High School and is a marching cat. And Mia, she's 22, getting her biology degree from Savannah State. She looks a lot like her daddy, Hilda said proudly. She can sing like him too. More of that Hilda laughter. So warm, so kind. My children say they don't care how old they are, they want to know, Hilda said. This is the only time of the year I publicly bring it back up. Hilda said she missed his witty humor and his musical genius talent. He could touch any instrument and play it, she said. He had a voice that would mesmerize anybody. All 3 of the children can sing too. I sing too, and he said he'd never marry anybody who couldn't sing. Here she laughed the most. She paused. A brief moment. held his heart is healing with her new love, Joseph Lee Miles, who proposed to her at the Brooks Company school system's Christmas social on December 1st. "It was a total surprise," she said. "He has stepped up as a great example and role model for the children," she said. "He always says he knows he can't replace their father, but he vows to be there for them and me 100%. He says all the time that they are amazing, respectful children, and their father would be proud."
Number 4.
Adrienne Salinas, 19, was a beautiful Gateway College student who vanished in the early morning hours of June 15, 2013. Her father reported her missing on Father's Day, June 16, 2013. According to Tempe police, Salinas and her roommates threw a party at their apartment on Hardy Drive and 5th Street in Tempe on June 15. After getting into an argument, Salinas and her boyfriend left the party early. Both planned on going to his home in Scottsdale. However, her boyfriend went home alone. Not much later, Salinas decided she would drive herself to her boyfriend's home, packed a bag, and left her apartment. On her way, she crashed her car along the Rio Salado Parkway and Ash Avenue curve not far from her home. She had flattened both tires on the driver's side, but managed to drive the car to Brown Street, where she parked and walked approximately 1 block back to her apartment. Police confirmed Salinas had ditched her vehicle, walked back home, changed her clothing, then called a cab to pick her up at an AM/PM convenience store about a quarter-mile away from her apartment. According to friends, she left her purse and keys at her apartment. When the taxi arrived at the convenience store at 4:53 a.m., the taxi driver called Salinas and she responded she was on her way. She proceeded to walk along the quarter-mile stretch to the convenience store, but vanished before she made it to the taxi. At 5:07 a.m., 14 minutes after the initial call from the cab driver, her phone shut off. Police stated Salinas disappeared while walking on Hardy Drive between 5th Street and University Drive in Tempe. A surveillance camera caught a woman resembling Salinas walking near the corner of Hardy and University Drive. She walked through an O'Reilly Auto Parts parking lot at 4:52 a.m. In the footage, she seemed to be followed by a dark 4-door vehicle driving through the same lot approximately 2 minutes later. The vehicle remains unidentified. Cell phone records show Salinas' boyfriend had 11 missed calls from Salinas at 4:15 a.m. to include a voicemail stating she was on her way to his home. The boyfriend has been very cooperative and was cleared through cell phone records, also passing several lie detector tests. The taxi driver was also cleared and has never been a suspect. A young girl walking alone on a hot June night in 2013, possibly there was someone else nearby, someone evil. When you have a case like this, there will be nights and nights and nights that you don't sleep. You only think about the case. What we have done, what we could do, and what should we have done, Detective Alan Aki told News 15 in an exclusive interview. Adrienne Salinas found dead 4 years ago, case remains unsolved. Was it a crime of opportunity, or was it something a little more, where somebody who had a little more interest in her was paying a little more attention to her and took that opportunity, asked Detective Aki. According to published freelance journalist Keen Azariah, she may have crossed paths with Ultimate Evil that fateful night. In July 2013, hard rainfall turned normally bone-dry Arizona canals, washes, and riverbeds into raging rivers of mud. On August 9, 2013, Apache Junction resident Dan Kelly decided to check his property after the flooding. His land borders Lost Dutchman Boulevard and Weeks Wash. It was here that he found the decomposing remains of Salinas in a desert wash, approximately 30 miles away from where she had vanished in Tempe. Police believe Salinas' body was dumped elsewhere and was later washed downstream to the location she was found. When the Tempe Police Department released the heavily redacted autopsy report, the skeletal chart was not included. As reported in the New Times, much desiccated skin and tissue are present, as is a small patch of hair adhering to what appears to be desiccated skin of the neck. The information released in the autopsy reports does not include any information about a skull, hands, or clothing. In fact, the autopsy report specifically indicates that Salinas was identified through the identification of her thorax, between neck and abdomen, in addition to DNA identification. The missing information makes one suspect she might have been decapitated either by human hands or by the natural process of decomposition and exposure to harsh elements of rushing water, followed by intense heat and potential animal scavenging. If authorities know the cause of death, they have not released it. Was Salinas a victim of opportunity? It just so happens, a monster was close by. Brian Patrick Miller is myriad of things in his social media profile, a man obsessed with steampunk and roleplay, and driving a decommissioned police cruiser, and calls himself the zombie hunter. He is also an alleged serial killer. Miller is currently being held in a Phoenix jail for his DNA-confirmed involvement in the cold case murder, decapitation, and evisceration of Angela Brasso, 22, and the stabbing and mutilation murder of Melanie Bernas, 17, 10 months apart, while riding their bikes along a North Phoenix canal in 1992. According to Facebook posts, Miller just so happened to be at a friend's party in Tempe on Saturday, June 15, near where Salinas went missing. According to Gone by Dawn, the disappearance of Adrienne Salinas, Keen Azariah, a published freelance journalist and former friend of Miller, says not only was Miller at a party within 1 mile of Salinas' home, but he had also planned on going on an early morning hike. Miller had also posted this information on Facebook asking if anyone wanted to go. Some may think it's a jump, but Miller owned a dark gray Ford Focus hatchback and a matte black Ford Escort. He sold the Focus in September 2013 and purchased a 2007 Ford Interceptor that he transformed into a creepy police car, complete with lights on top. On the back was the name Zombie Hunter, his alter ego. When police made the arrested Miller at his job at Amazon for the murders of Brasso and Bernas, they simultaneously served a search warrant on his home. Police found the matte black Escort under a black tarp hidden in the backyard of his North Phoenix residence. While that is not proof that Miller abducted Salinas, we must also take into consideration that Miller also worked at the Arizona Renaissance Festival in Apache Junction near where Salinas was found, attended steampunk events at Goldfield Ghost Town, and even selected the area to do some professional photo shoots. Though the inferences of a connection between Miller and Salinas are circumstantial, the leap continues to get shorter. For those who know Brian personally, it becomes even more possible to believe he was capable of abducting a young woman. He was known for collecting realistic photographs of dead bodies, posting cannibalistic connotations on Facebook to include pictures of decapitated and mutilated women. And if all of this were not enough, Miller lived less than a mile from Brandy Myers, who has been missing for over 25 years. And if all of this were not enough, Miller lived less than a mile from Brandy Myers, who has been missing for over 25 years. Brandy Myers had gone out on the afternoon of May 26, 1992, to go door to door raising money for her school. She never returned home. Myers' younger sister Kristen Thielen recalled walking with her big sister on their way to school and back, on a route that took them right by Miller's house each day. Ultimately, we have another disappearance of a young girl, same kind of age and time frame, and very close proximity to his home, said Sergeant Trent Crump with Phoenix Police Department. He very quickly became an investigative lead. Police have a statement from Miller's wife of 8 years. She tells about a terrifying existence with a man fascinated by porn, S&M bondage, the use of knives, straight pins, and boasting. She claims Miller confessed that he had killed before and mentioned a time when a little girl with developmental disabilities came to his house raising money for her school. He told his ex-wife he abducted her inside, stabbed the child, then cut her throat. Miller then told his wife he dismembered the little girl and dumped her in the garbage that was picked up the following day in 1992. It so happens Brandy Myers did have diminished mental capacity. Miller has pleaded not guilty in the murders of Brasso and Bernas. Miller would be quick to say his being near where women and little girls vanishing is just coincidence. Others would say there are too many coincidences to dismiss. A $20,000 reward is being offered for information that leads to the arrest and convictions of the individuals responsible for the murder of Adrienne Salinas. Call Silent Witness at 480 Witness.
Number 5.
Investigation discoveries still a mystery. New beginnings, violent endings looks at 2 unsolved murders that left the victims' families with more questions than answers. One of them is the killing of Amber Berbiglia. The 23-year-old had her whole life ahead of her when she was found brutally murdered under a bridge in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The police were stumped with the case as it seemed to be a random killing and leads were hard to come by. Are you wondering what exactly happened? We've got you covered. How did Amber Berbiglia die? Amber was born in Poughkeepsie, New York. She came from a big and loving family and had many siblings. Known for her personality, Amber was socially active and had a lot of friends who adored her. Her dream was always to be a costume designer, and she started to work towards that by moving to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in 2008 and enrolling in Horry Georgetown Technical College. She studied costume and fashion designing there and, in 2011, had the opportunity to fly out to London, England, with the school. During her time there, she had met the man of her dreams, Jose Soler. The couple dated for about 2 years and were engaged to be married. Amber and Jose planned to get married in June 2013, just after her graduation. But her dreams ended all of a sudden just weeks before their planned wedding. On May 3, 2013, Amber did not show up at the restaurant she was supposed to work at during the afternoon. Later the same day, a passerby called 911 after noticing a body under the overpass of a local bridge. Amber was found in a pool of blood with her still running car right there. The crime was so brutal that the police initially thought she died of gunshot wounds to her head, but an autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was blunt force trauma. Her body also showed evidence of defensive wounds. Who killed Amber Berbiglia? Right off the bat, this was a tough case to get to the bottom of. A search of the area where Amber was found revealed nothing substantial. The murder weapon was not recovered either. An investigation into Amber's life didn't turn up any leads. She had never done anything illegal or been involved in any criminal activity. So, they hoped to track her last known whereabouts using surveillance camera footage. Amber was recorded by a camera at a local gas station that day, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Sometime around 1 p.m. that afternoon, she was captured by surveillance cameras while paying her cable bill at the local office. A man that was behind her in the line seemed to behave in a suspicious manner, but he was tracked down and ruled out as a suspect. This office was about a mile from where Amber was found about 2 hours later. The police then turned to track her through surveillance cameras on the highway. As the detectives poured through the footage, they realized that Amber was not alone that day. In the footage, they could see Amber driving on the highway before she cut into a nearby street. She was picked up by the cameras about half an hour later, and this time around, there was someone else in the car with her. A shadowy figure was seen, but could not be identified. As time passed, the leads that were coming in stopped. Investigators believed that anyone possible vacationers who might have seen something would have long left the city by then, making it difficult to track them down. In the end, the case turned cold. The detectives stated that they were still looking for new leads and would reopen the case once any promising information turns up. Amber's mother, Michelle Robinson, and the family have been fighting to find her daughter's killer over the years. There have been vigils held in Amber's memory, and Michelle has a garden outside her home dedicated to her. She felt that the case wasn't investigated carefully enough and hoped for it to be reopened. She said, "It's a dead end, and I just need help." Closure and acceptance in any death is hard, but especially with a murder.
Number 6.
Angelina Sicola, 20, was found murdered in her Colorado Springs, Colorado apartment on May 2, 2013. The young woman was a student at University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, and she also worked as a martial arts instructor. Angelina was experienced in Taekwondo and was preparing to take test for her second-degree black belt. Unfortunately, before she had the opportunity, her life was cut short. One of Angelina's professors first noticed something was off on May 1, the day before her body was found. Angelina did not show up for class that day, which was very uncharacteristic of her. Angelina also had plans to meet up with her father at a doctor's appointment on May 2. When she did not show up as planned, her father went to her apartment to check on her. Once inside, Angelina's father discovered a horrific scene. Angelina was dead. She had been strangled to death. There was no sign of forced entry in Angelina's apartment, which indicates that Angelina was likely killed by somebody she knew. As an experienced martial artist, Angelina knew how to defend herself, so it is possible that Angelina left bruises and/or other defensive wounds on her attacker. Though years have passed since her murder, investigators are hoping that someone will recall seeing a person with unusual bruisings or markings on their body around the time of Angelina's death. Detectives have otherwise kept quiet about the details of their investigation into Angelina's murder. At this time, nobody has been arrested or charged with anything related to her case. No suspects or persons have been publicly identified. Angelina's case remains unsolved today. If you have any information that could help the investigation, please contact the Colorado Bureau of Investigations at 303-239-4201.
Number 7.
On January 11, 2013, the body of 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson was found in the most unusual of circumstances, upside down and rolled up in a school gym mat. The mysterious death of Kendrick Johnson was initially ruled an accident by law enforcement, but his family was not convinced. The initial autopsy revealed that Johnson died due to positional asphyxia, or that he suffocated as a result of being stuck upside down in an enclosed space for an extended period of time. Just after 24 hours of being found, the investigators ruled Johnson's death an accident. The sheriff's department asserted that Johnson must have accidentally fallen into the center of the mat while reaching for a sneaker, which he had stored there so as not to have to pay for a locker. But Johnson's parents felt that his death was not being taken seriously, in part because of his race or because a larger cover-up was at play. Kendrick Johnson lived with his family in Valdosta, Georgia and attended Lowndes High School. His family and friends described him as a sweet and quiet boy. He was a three-sport athlete and dreamed of one day playing professional football. But those dreams were cut short when his body was found by students entering the gymnasium rolled up in a standing gym mat. His sneakers were shoved behind his knees. But investigators quickly closed their case on the theory that Johnson had simply fallen into the mat while reaching for one of his sneakers. Indeed, when the mat was first unrolled, Johnson did have one arm stretched above his head and the other down around his waist, as though struggling for his shoe. He was just in his socks. Students had also told police that it was common for them to leave their belongings in the mats when they didn't want to pay for a locker. The mat in which Johnson was found was around 6 feet tall. When rolled up, the mat left a 14-inch hole in diameter in the center. Johnson's shoulders measured 19 across, and he was 5 feet, 10 inches tall. It seemed possible that if Kendrick was trying to squeeze into the center of the mat, he could have scrunched his shoulders together to make himself narrower. But his parents would later maintain that his size versus the size of the mat alone was enough to debunk the investigators' case. Almost a full day had passed until Johnson had been discovered. As he was upside down, blood would have rushed to Johnson's head and he eventually would have begun to bleed from his facial orifices. But this is one of the most baffling mysteries of this case. The black and white gym shoe that lay on the ground below Kendrick Johnson, the one he was presumed to be reaching for, was lying on top of a pool of blood, but there was no blood on the shoe itself. A hoodie and a pair of orange and black gym shoes were also found lying on the floor of the gym, as well as traces of blood on the wall nearby. Investigators tested the blood, which revealed that it did not belong to Kendrick Johnson. They also reported that the blood had likely been there for a long time. Investigators did not take the hoodie and orange and black gym shoes into evidence. Johnson's parents were suspicious of the investigation from the beginning. They believed that the sheriff's department was too quick to rule out foul play as a cause for Johnson's death, considering that within 24 hours of finding Kendrick Johnson's body, they concluded that it was an accident. The Johnsons were also sure that their son's body had been moved, which was corroborated by Lowndes County Coroner Bill Watson. Georgia state law dictates that the coroner be contacted immediately on the discovery of a body, but Watson claimed that he was not notified until 6 hours later. Furthermore, Johnson's parents argued, if this was an accident, how could no one have heard Kendrick call for help in a high school of over 3,000 students? Johnson's parents finally believed that their son's death was not being taken seriously because of his race. Kendrick Johnson was black, and the Lowndes County Sheriff, Chris Prines, and his investigators were all white. Indeed, in 2013, racism in Valdosta, Georgia, was still very much alive. The family's attorney, Chavez King, expressed that if Kendrick had been white, the case would have been handled differently. Kendrick Johnson's parents released a photo to the media of their son's face as he lay in the funeral home. The photo, in which Kendrick Johnson's face is extremely swollen, almost does not look human. The public was horrified by the photo and began to rally around the Johnsons in their quest for the truth. On May 8, 2013, a judge granted Kendrick Johnson's body be exhumed. A private pathologist was hired to carry out a second autopsy. This time, the autopsy revealed that Kendrick Johnson had suffered hemorrhaging on the right side of his neck, which meant that he likely died from blunt force trauma. The pathologist concluded his death was not an accident. On top of this, the second autopsy revealed that some of Johnson's organs were missing, and in their place, his body had been stuffed with newspaper. The Georgia Bureau of Investigations, GBI, claimed that when the body was sent to the funeral home after the first autopsy, Johnson's organs had been put back inside the body. However, the coroner said these organs were not sent to the funeral home because they were too decomposed and were instead disposed of beforehand. The funeral home said that it received the body without organs, which it replaced with paper or sawdust, as is common practice while embalming. The Johnsons did try to sue the funeral home for mishandling their son's body and perhaps having done so in order to cover up his true cause of death, but this case was dropped. Regardless, the organs were lost and could not be tested during the second autopsy, which further aroused suspicions in Johnson's parents that this was a cover-up. As a result of this new evidence, Matthew Moore, the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Georgia, announced a formal review of the case. The Johnsons hoped for a coroner's inquest, which would begin the process of reclassifying the cause of Kendrick Johnson's death as non-accidental and reopening the investigation. The request, however, was denied, even though the coroner Bill Watson had originally expressed a lack of confidence in the sheriff department's handling of the case. CNN gained access to the school's security footage on the day that Kendrick Johnson was killed, but upon viewing it, realized that it offered little insight into what happened that day. The cameras which faced the mats were unfocused and skipped around. All that could be seen from the cameras was Kendrick Johnson walking towards the gym, and then several seconds of footage of him jogging within the gym. He was never shown within or leaving the gym, and indeed, he never did show up for his following classes. Furthermore, a whole hour of footage from the gym was missing, right at the time, which would have shed light on what happened that day. This finding further increased the confidence of doubters that this death was an accident. Then, in 2014, Kendrick Johnson's parents filed a wrongful death suit against the school's officials, alleging that Johnson had been harassed by a white student, which went neglected by the school, perhaps due to his race. Ebony.com described the murder of Johnson to have been at the hands of two white brothers, though they did not include names. The description of these brothers closely resembled that of Brian and Brandon Bell, who the magazine claimed had killed Kendrick because of a fight they had had over a year earlier, which had escalated. The Johnsons also accused the brothers' father, an FBI agent at the time, of covering up the murder by manipulating the school and authorities involved in investigating Johnson's death. In 2015, the Johnsons filed a $100 million civil lawsuit against 38 people, including 3 of their son's classmates, the school, the local crime lab, state and federal officials, 5 agents of the GBI, an FBI agent, and more. The parents asserted that the sons of the FBI agent killed Johnson and used their connections to cover up the investigation.